So there's this Latin proverb that I see bouncing around the internet from time to time that says this: revenge is a confession of pain. And whatever truth there is to that statement, I think when you study the French Revolution, you start to see why it might be a little bit accurate. In the Revolution, the groups that suffered the most returned an equal amount of suffering on their enemies when the tables turned. In this video, we're going to look at the Thermidorian reaction, or the period that followed after the fall of the Terror. We're going to look at what that reaction was, and how it existed, and how it showed up at both the popular and official levels. And we're going to look at what the reaction meant for the course of the revolution. Okay, let's get going. For this video, you're going to need something to take notes with, and one primary source, the memoirs of Georges Duval. This source tells us a little bit about the reactionary politics at the popular level in Paris. To begin, let's pick up where we left off, at the height of the Terror in the summer of 1794.
We already know about how deadly the Terror was. It was a period of extraordinary violence not only at the popular level, but at the official level. The state institutionalized terror took the lives of thousands of people in France, including not only aristocrats and Vendéan rebels, but also those who were closely identified with the Montagnards and the regime of the Terror. For example, on March 24th, 1794, after a 3-day trial, Jacques-René Hébert and his associates were executed on the state guillotine for planning an insurrection against the convention. A few weeks later, the Revolutionary Tribunal targeted Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and Fabre d'Églantine, aka the Indulgents, put them on trial and executed them as well. The revolution's leaders were falling one by one. One leader, however, was nearing the peak of his powers, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was at the center of the Committee of Public Safety. It was largely his agenda that was being pushed in the committee and elsewhere in France. And some laws in the early summer of 1794 extended his power even further. The most significant was the law of 22 Prairial that reformed the process for the Revolutionary Tribunal, making it far easier for the tribunal to prosecute suspects and mandating that the only penalty for being convicted was death. In the month following the 22 Prairial law, some 1,500 people were executed at the Place de la Révolution in Paris. Although he was at the peak of his powers, however, Robespierre also suffered from an intense fear. In May 1794, there was an assassination attempt on Robespierre that drove him to mostly stay out of the public eye. It also drove him to a new wave of accusations and denunciations. It was said that in June 1794, there were as many as 60 members of the convention that were afraid to sleep in their own beds at night, expecting to be the next on Robespierre's lists. The fear of Robespierre's colleagues turned enemies led them to actually begin plotting against the revolutionary leader. Secret conversations occurred to denounce Robespierre himself and his closest allies should they push for further executions. The moment for this counterattack came in late July 1794.
The fall of Robespierre marked the end of the Terror. And that fall occurred in a series of events that happened in July 1794 that are collectively known as Thermidor, or the Thermidorian Revolution. And to find out a little bit more about the Thermidorian Revolution, we turn to our old friend Traveler Watkins, who's reporting live from Paris. So, Traveler, take it away.
Hey everyone, I'm here at the Luxembourg Palace at the north end of the Jardin du Luxembourg. It's a beautiful garden. And right now, the Luxembourg Palace is actually the home of the French Senate, but it has actually a pretty long history and a really interesting one during the Revolution. See, this palace was the site of one of the most momentous few days of the Revolution's entire history, a few days that are collectively known as Thermidor. And the story of Thermidor has to do with the fact that the palace was one among many palaces in France that during the Revolution was turned into a prison. So here, prisoners were stored for all sorts of reasons and for any amount of time. And it was here that in 1794, Robespierre and some of his comrades were imprisoned and brought here after a truly revolutionary few days in the National Convention. To understand this, you have to know a little bit about the context of what was happening during 1794. This was the height of the time called the Terror, when the state had sort of mobilized to target and execute all sorts of enemies. First, royalists and counter-revolutionaries, but eventually other groups too. For example, Danton and the Indulgents, or the Hébertistes. Basically, anyone who was targeted as as an oppositional political force to Robespierre and his cadre were seen as enemies of the state, and many of them were imprisoned and executed over the course of 1794. So by the summer of 1794, Robespierre was both at the height of his power, but also sort of the subject of growing resentment and tension and fear in the convention and throughout France. And that fear and resentment sort of reached a peak on July 26th, 1794, or a day also known as 8th Thermidor. Robespierre went to the National Convention that day and gave a 2-hour-long speech, a really famous one, in which he decried continued action of traitors in France and called out for another purge of the enemies of the state and the enemies of the nation. And he promised to deliver a list of names of members of the convention who were traitors. That set the entire convention on edge. And the next day, when his comrade and right-hand man, Saint-Just, entered the convention and walked up to the rostrum with the promised list of names, seemingly a riot broke out on the National Convention floor. People started shouting out, "Down with the tyrant," and "Arrest him!" And eventually someone blitzed the rostrum and actually grabbed Saint-Just and stopped him from speaking. Others grabbed Robespierre and Robespierre's brother, and they mobbed them and brought them actually here to the Luxembourg prison at that time, or the Luxembourg Palace, where they threw them in jail to await a trial, right, for treason, for the exact same thing that they had been accusing others of. This momentous day on July 27th was the beginning of what was called the Thermidorian reaction, or the Thermidorian Revolution, when Robespierre and his sort of cohort were replaced. It was a veritable coup d'etat in a way, right? When people rejected Robespierre and his power and went to supplant him. So they brought Robespierre and his friends here to the palace. And at the palace during the nights of July 27th and July 28th, they stayed here. And there are lots of stories about that night. One such story is that Robespierre was trading insults with one of the guards that were here to protect him. And after accusing the man of being a traitor and saying that he will have him shot, one story goes that the soldier actually took his revenge by shooting Robespierre in the face, shattering his jaw. Another way that the story goes is that Robespierre, sort of seeing his own fate, wanted to take his own life, so he managed to grab a gun from a guard and shoot himself in the face. We're not sure exactly how it happened. We know the results were basically the same. Robespierre came out of the night of July 27th with a shattered jaw, bloodied and bruised. Others were injured as well. One of his friends tried to escape by jumping out of one of these windows, breaking his legs on impact. The result is that none of them managed to get away. And what was even more disappointing for them is that the sans-culottes of Paris, the real sort of revolutionary vanguard here in the city, failed to come rescue them. Both Robespierre and Saint-Just thought that the sans-culottes would storm the prison, right? Liberate Robespierre, liberate his crew. But the reality is that by July 1794, the terror had sort of taken a turn. All of that revolutionary violence had reached a sort of fevered pitch that was becoming too much, not only for members of the convention, but even for the most revolutionary of population of Paris, the sans-culottes as well. So, having failed to be rescued, Robespierre and his friends the next day were dragged here from the Luxembourg prison to the Place de la Révolution, which is about a mile northwest of here, where they were marched up to the gallows and executed by the state guillotine. So these events that took place from July 26th to July 28th, 1794, are collectively known as Thermidor, or the Thermidorian reaction. And they're momentous because they were the end point of the most revolutionary phase, the most radical phase of the entire French Revolution, the Terror. These were the events that shut down Robespierre and the most radical bunch and initiated a reaction that swung the political pendulum from the far left to the far right.
Thank you, Traveler. The fall of Robespierre brought a reactionary politics, not only to the National Convention, but to the rest of France. Members of the Plain, or the so-called sort of group of non-aligned people in the convention, right? Not Montagnards, not Girondins, sort of people in the middle. They came to dominate the National Convention. And in the weeks and months following the fall of Robespierre, they started to put into place a new agenda, one that was far more moderate, and one that started to systematically dismantle the apparatuses and institutions of the Terror.
The National Convention, purged of Robespierre and Saint-Just and many of their closest associates, began to chart a far different political course than the one designed by Robespierre during the Great Terror. Bit by bit, they began to dismantle those apparatuses that had enabled Robespierre to enact terror on the population. First, they almost immediately repealed the law of 22 Prairial, realizing that this law was perhaps the most important piece of legislation for the extraordinary violence of the Great Terror. They quickly worked to remove it on August the 1st. From this point forward, trials had to once again use standard policies of jurisprudence and allow witnesses and base decisions on evidence and enable defendants to have lawyers to defend themselves. A little over a week later, the convention then attacked the tribunals themselves. They purged the membership of the tribunals of any judges who had close connections with Robespierre, which turned out to be a lot of the tribunal's judges. As a result, the tribunal's activities slowed markedly. Only 6 people were guillotined in August 1794, and only 40 for the rest of the year. That was a dramatic decrease from the month prior. The era of extreme institutionalized violence seemed to be coming to an end. The tribunal itself was eventually abolished in May 1795. On August 24th, the convention passed a law that reduced the number of watch committees in France from 48 in Paris to 12, and 1 per district elsewhere in France. The idea here, again, was that the institutions that sent so many people to the tribunal for such small reasons, as we discovered last week, should be limited in its authority and its scope. Eventually, the convention paired these measures with extraordinary decrees, releasing thousands of prisoners throughout France. By the end of August, some 3,500 prisoners had been freed from French prisons by the new convention. The reactionary convention even made motions to revive religious life in France. In a law of September 1794, the convention disbanded the Constitutional Church, as well as the cult of the Supreme Being that Robespierre had helped set up. It declared that the state would no longer have any formal relationship with any religious body in France. And then in February 1795, it made this official by reaffirming the freedom of all religious worship in France so long as it was done privately and not in the public eye. There could be no outward religious symbols displayed in public, including crosses, even priestly garments and bells. But religious groups could practice freely within the confines of their own homes or within private buildings. This cultural turn also manifested itself in other ways. In February 1795, the state officially removed the remains of Jean-Paul Marat from the Pantheon, the state mausoleum of revolutionary leaders, and thus disassociated itself with the radicals' ideas and platform. And then a few months later, the convention even provided amnesty for all those who had participated in the Federalist revolts. They were allowed back in France if they had fled, and exonerated officially. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, the convention ratified a new constitution in August 1795 that re-established the rule of law in the country. France once again became a constitutionally based republic, and thus turned the page on the year-long experiment in revolutionary authoritarianism. In other words, within the course of about a year, the convention had dismantled much of the mechanism that had enabled the terror and brought France back to a certain form of democracy.
That said, the Thermidorian period was not a period without violence. In fact, there was quite a bit of violence at the popular level and to some degree at the state and institutional and official level. But the direction of the violence changed. Instead of violence enacted by Jacobins against reactionaries, against people that they deemed counter-revolutionaries, the violence of the Thermidorian period was violence taken on by those who had suffered during the terror against those who propagated the terror. The eruption of violence in late 1794 and early 1795 was dubbed the White Terror, in large part because of the fact that the terror was sort of happening, the violence was happening by those who promoted royalism sometimes, and the values of a previous era, the values of the old regime in certain ways. So the White Terror was a moment of renewed violence, but in a very different direction from the kind of violence that we saw over the course of the previous year.
The terror had brought about a tremendous amount of violence and a cultural shift toward those values and behaviors of the sans-culottes. During the terror, to be a sans-culotte was to be an ardent and trustworthy revolutionary, and to display the temperament or sensibilities of any other group could place you in danger of going before the tribunal. That said, there were still many in France whose cultural sensibilities were not those of the sans-culottes, and many of these people re-emerged in the public sphere in the wake of the Thermidorian Revolution. Perhaps the most conspicuous of these groups was the Gilded Youth, a group led by a member of the convention, Stanislas Ferron. The Gilded Youth were largely young people who belonged to upper-class Parisian society, usually the sons of wealthy members of the bourgeoisie and some former aristocrats. Dressing completely differently from the sans-culottes, they sported sort of fashionable coats that went down to the mid-thigh, and they brought back stockings and culottes, and wore top hats instead of Phrygian caps like the Jacobins. They began showing up in groups throughout Paris and harassing sans-culottes and all those that were associated with the terror. They cut down liberty trees, painted over sans-culotte graffiti, removed busts of Marat from public buildings. Sometimes they even clashed head-to-head with groups of sans-culottes and Jacobins. Freron directed many of their activities and used them as a sort of anti-Jacobin gang to punish all those that they felt were responsible for the horrors of the terror. And what's worse, the convention largely turned a blind eye to their activities, tacitly allowing their extra-legal activities and promotion of vengeance throughout the city. Yet this wave of vengeance showed up throughout France. Much of it came from the previously imprisoned population. Many who were given amnesty and released from prisons in August and the rest of the fall of 1794, many of them immediately set to punish those who had placed them in prison in the first place. They began organizing groups to go after Jacobins and former leaders of the terror. They created new royalist and reactionary newspapers that called for retributive violence against the sans-culottes. In Nîmes, a group called the Companies of the Sun emerged and began to harass former members of the terror. In February 1795, they began abducting former politicians and murdering them. Judges of the Revolutionary Tribunal and former municipal authorities were lynched in Nîmes and Avignon. And in Lyon, reactionaries raided a prison, newly packed with former terrorists and those arrested in the wake of the Thermidorian Revolution, and murdered them en masse in an incident eerily reminiscent of the September massacres of 1792. Over 100 people were killed in the city. Similar incidents happened elsewhere: Tarascon, Aix-en-Provence, Marseille, Saint-Étienne. All told, around 2,000 people were killed in this wave of violence in the early months of 1795. Former aristocrats and revolutionary moderates got their revenge on the leaders of the terror and many of the people who had supported them.
Okay, it's at this point that I want you to take a closer look at the types of violence that came up during the Thermidorian reaction. So what I want you to do is pause this video and take a look at the primary source that I mentioned to you earlier, the memoir of Georges Duval.
What a difference the Thermidor makes. You can see just how much had changed in such a short amount of time in this document. One thing that I think is particularly interesting is the incident at the Jacobin Club. Here's a passage that I thought was really interesting. Duval writes, "The Jacobins shut up in their hall and the siege dragged on. We were about to mount an assault by the windows when the besieged made a sortie. Then there really was a free-for-all, and prisoners were taken on both sides. The Jacobins took theirs into the hall, and we locked ours, among whom were several sisters, in the former refectory of the order, and put guards on the door. They penetrated into the rostrums occupied by the Jacobin sisters of the Fraternal Society, and as they peaceably crossed the rostrums to get to the hall, the shrews attacked them, armed with knives, long knitting needles, and open scissors with which they wounded a few of our men. What do we see here? Well, put simply, what we're seeing is gang violence in full force. Attacks on headquarters, taking of hostages, outright violence, etc., right? That's what gang violence sort of looks like in the 18th century. Thermidor brought about a sort of devolution, a de-evolution of order. The terror saw a lot of violence, but that violence was largely in the hands of the state and its authorities. The Thermidorian reaction saw that violence once again trickle into the hands of the populace and take the form of unofficial raids, gang violence, crime, even spontaneous lynchings. And all of this was done in the name of revenge.
That's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how the convention tried to re-establish order in France amidst a host of challenges. And in that video, we're also going to meet a certain someone that will be important for the rest of this course, a young Corsican military officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. But until then, see you in class. Good job, good luck.